Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're switching gears a bit. We're going to be focusing on something specifically for our listeners out there who are prepping for the UPSC exams, especially those of you focusing on international relations as an optional paper. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a deep dive into a question that might seem a little academic at first glance, but trust me, this has huge implications for how we understand global politics. Why did traditional political theory decline?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating journey through the evolution of political thought. And it's not just about looking back. Grasping these shifts that happened in political theory is kind of like getting a cheat code. It's a cheat code for critically analyzing everything from political movements and ideologies to the very theories that are shaping international relations today.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. One of the first figures we got to talk about is Karl Marx. He's famous for saying philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So what's interesting here is how he kind of blurred the lines between theory and action, right?
Exactly. Marx wasn't content with just sitting back and pondering the world. He wanted to revolutionize it. This makes him more of an ideologue than a traditional political theorist, if you think about it. Someone like Plato was trying to define like the ideal republic, but Marx, he was writing the Communist Manifesto, a blueprint for action.
So for our UPSC folks out there, how does this distinction between a theorist and an ideologue actually play out in international relations?
It's crucial for analyzing political movements and also leaders on the world stage. Take Lenin or Mao, for example. By understanding their ideological roots, you can better grasp their motivations, strategies, and ultimately their impact on the global landscape. This applies even today. Think about how different political ideologies, how they influence a nation's foreign policy decisions.
That's a crucial point. All right, moving on, let's talk about positivism. I always think of Auguste Comte. He's considered the father of positivism, and his laser focus on observable facts.
Yeah, Comte was all about verifiable knowledge. He argued that only what could be empirically observed and measured, only that was truly meaningful. So, metaphysics, ethics, theology, those more abstract areas of thought, they were basically dismissed as mere speculation.
So positivism really shifted the focus of how we study things, including politics,
Hmm.
shifted the focus towards what we can actually see and measure.
Absolutely. And it had a major impact on how political science and international relations developed as academic disciplines. You see a surge in quantitative methods, statistical analysis, and this quest for finding scientific laws to explain political behavior.
Now, this is where things get even more interesting. Enter the Vienna Circle and their brand of logical positivism. They kind of took positivism and ran with it, focusing heavily on the precision of language.
Yeah, they were obsessed with the idea of verification. To them, a statement was meaningful if it could be empirically tested or if it was a tautology, meaning it was true by definition.
So are they basically saying that most of what traditional political philosophers talked about was meaningless? Because you can't exactly put concepts like justice or freedom under a microscope.
Pretty much. Many of the big, enduring questions in political philosophy, according to logical positivism, they couldn't be empirically tested, so they were deemed meaningless.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this all
Yeah.
connects. But how does this specifically help someone prepping for the UPSC?
Well, for starters, it gives you a framework to understand the evolution of political thought and all those different schools of thought that have emerged. You'll be able to critically analyze the methodologies used in political science and international relations. And that's key for those essay questions. Remember, the UPSC isn't just about memorizing facts, it's about showing a nuanced understanding of complex ideas.
All right, next up we have Karl Popper and his concept of falsification. He really turned scientific thinking on its head, right? Instead of searching for evidence to support our theories, he said we should actively try to disprove them.
Exactly. Popper argued that we can never definitively prove a theory true, but we can potentially prove it false. And this shift from verification to falsification had a huge impact. It impacted how we approach knowledge, not just in science, but also in fields like political science and international relations.
So how does this apply to someone studying global politics, especially for the UPSC?
Well, it encourages a much more critical and skeptical approach. When you're analyzing political events and arguments, think about it when you're reading those dense IR articles or when you're trying to make sense of a complex international conflict. Popper's ideas help you break down arguments, spot logical fallacies, and evaluate the validity of different theories. It's all about honing those critical thinking skills. And those are absolute gold for the UPSC.
Now, let's not forget about the impact of linguistic philosophy. These folks were all about the power of language and how it shapes our understanding of the world.
Right. They believed that many philosophical problems were actually rooted in misunderstandings or misuses of language. So instead of trying to define justice in some abstract, universal sense, they would focus on how the word justice is actually used in different contexts.
I can see how that would be relevant for deconstructing political rhetoric and propaganda, which is everywhere these days, especially in international relations.
Absolutely. Think about the language used in diplomatic negotiations and international treaties, even in political speeches. Understanding the nuances of language and how it can be used to persuade, manipulate, or even deceive, that's crucial for anyone analyzing global politics, especially for the UPSC. You'll be sifting through mountains of information, and you need to be able to read between the lines.
Right, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, let's talk about Max Weber. He was a sociologist who brought a more nuanced perspective, I think, to the relationship between values and scientific inquiry. He said that while our values inevitably influence what we choose to study and how we interpret things, science itself can't tell us which values are right or wrong.
It's a balancing act. Weber acknowledged that social science is inherently value relevant, meaning our values influence our research, but it can't validate those values objectively. And this is incredibly important for understanding objectivity and bias in political analysis, which is something you'll be doing a lot of in the UPSC, especially in international relations.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but we're just getting started. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll explore some of the challenges and criticisms leveled against these influential movements that shaped how we think about politics. And for all you UPSC aspirants out there, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives tailored to your journey. We'll be back in a flash.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the decline of political theory. Before the break, we were discussing some heavy hitters like Marx, Comte, and Popper, thinkers whose ideas really shook up the world of political thought. But as with any major intellectual shift, there was bound to be some pushback.
Right, not everyone was totally on board with the positivism train, especially when it came to something as complex as politics. So what were some of the criticisms leveled against this idea of making politics a purely empirical science?
Well, one of the main critiques was that reducing politics to just observable phenomena ignores the crucial role of things like values, ideas, and even emotions. All those things are pretty hard to measure and quantify, but they definitely shape how political actors behave, especially on the international stage.
Yeah, I can see that. Like if you're trying to understand why a country decides to go to war, you can't just look at the numbers, right?
Yeah.
Their military strength, their economic resources, all that.
Yeah.
You also have to understand their motivations, their historical narratives, their fears, their ambitions. All that stuff plays a huge role in international relations.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the limitations of positivism and logical positivism becomes super important, especially for UPSC aspirants. You need to be able to analyze political events and actors through multiple lenses, not just through a purely empirical one. This is especially true for international relations, where things are rarely black and white.
So if positivism wasn't the be-all and end-all, what were some of the alternative approaches that emerged? I know we briefly touched on linguistics philosophy before the break, but how did that actually play out in the study of politics?
Well, thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, they argued that many philosophical problems, including those in political philosophy, were actually linguistic puzzles. So they were more interested in analyzing how we use language to talk about politics than in, trying to come up with grand theories about the world.
So instead of trying to define, say, justice in some absolute sense, they look at how the word justice is used in different political contexts and how those different uses shape our understanding of political issues.
Precisely. And this approach has implications for how we understand everything from political rhetoric and propaganda to the language used in diplomatic negotiations and international treaties.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
For our UPSC folks out there, especially those focusing on international relations, being able to deconstruct political language and understand the subtle ways it's used to persuade or manipulate is incredibly important.
Absolutely. You'll be dealing with a ton of information from various sources, often with conflicting perspectives. So being able to cut through the noise and identify the underlying assumptions and arguments at play, that's crucial.
Now, speaking of conflicting perspectives, our source material mentions a pretty interesting critique of the idea that political philosophy has no real-world impact. Some argue that political philosophers are just ivory tower academics, detached from the messy realities of politics.
Right. There's this notion that political theory is just a purely academic exercise with no real influence on how politicians actually behave. But there are tons of examples that contradict this view.
Yeah, they specifically mention Locke's influence on the American Constitution, Gandhi's inspiration from thinkers like Ruskin and Thoreau, and even narrows debt to Fabian collectivism. These examples show how political ideas can have a very real and lasting impact, even if that influence isn't always immediately obvious.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of understanding the historical context and also the intellectual currents that shape political events, even those that seem purely driven by pragmatic concerns. This is especially relevant for understanding international relations, where the legacies of past thinkers and ideologies, they continue to shape the global landscape.
This brings us back to Max Weber, who offered a more nuanced view on the relationship between values in science and social inquiry. He argued that while our values inevitably influence our research, we should strive for objectivity.
Right. Weber recognized that it's impossible to completely eliminate the role of values in our analysis. After all, we choose what to study and how to interpret our findings based on what we consider important. But he emphasized the importance of transparency, being upfront about our assumptions and potential biases.
So it's about being aware of those biases
Right.
and striving for as much objectivity as possible, even if we can never fully achieve it.
Exactly. And this is a skill that's valuable not just for academics, but for anyone trying to make sense of the world, especially those preparing for the UPSC. Whether you're analyzing historical events or dissecting a political argument, or even trying to understand the motivations of different actors on the global stage, being aware of your own biases and those of your sources is absolutely essential.
Now, before we move on, I want to highlight something our source material mentions about the period from the late 19th century to World War II. It's often seen as a kind of a bleak time for political theory, kind of like it was in decline. But apparently there were still some notable contributions during this period, right?
That's right. It's important to remember that intellectual history is rarely neat and tidy. Even during periods of, supposed decline or upheaval, there are always individuals and schools of thought that challenge the prevailing orthodoxy and offer alternative perspectives.
Our source specifically mentions thinkers like Bernard Bosanquet, Antonio Gramsci, and Thomas Hill Green. Were they kind of swimming against the tide during this time?
In a way, yes. They, along with others like Soren Kierkegaard and the theorists of the Frankfurt School, they continued to grapple with those fundamental questions of political philosophy. Even as the discipline was being reshaped by, forces like positivism, ideology, and linguistic analysis, they kept the flame of political theory burning bright, so to speak.
It's a good reminder that there's never just one dominant way of thinking about things, right? And that's especially true in a field as dynamic and complex as politics, and even more so in international relations.
Absolutely. Intellectual history is full of competing ideas and approaches, constantly vying for dominance. And for those preparing for the UPSC, being able to understand and engage with those competing ideas is crucial for developing a nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the world.
Now, our source also delves into the emergence of political science as a distinct discipline in the early 20th century, with political theory kind of becoming one of its subfields.
Yes. And this development was closely tied to the rise of positivism and the desire to make the study of politics more scientific, as we discussed earlier.
It specifically mentions the University of Chicago School and figures like Charles Merriam and Graham Wallas. How did they shape this new scientific approach to studying politics?
Well, they were big proponents of using quantitative methods, statistical analysis, and concepts borrowed from other disciplines like psychology and sociology. They wanted to make political science more empirical and data-driven, moving away from the more abstract and philosophical approaches that had dominated political theory in the past.
So even though political theory was still considered part of political science, its status and influence were arguably diminished by this emphasis on empirical research and quantitative methods. It was almost like political theory got pushed to the side a bit.
That's one way to look at it. However, it's important to remember that the relationship between empirical political science and political theory wasn't always adversarial. There were times, particularly in the 1920s, when the two were seen as complementary, with each approach informing and enriching the other.
So it wasn't necessarily a clean break or a complete rejection of traditional political theory, but rather a shift in emphasis and methodology.
Precisely. And this nuance is important to keep in mind as you study political science and international relations for the UPSC. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that it's a simple dichotomy between, scientific political science and unscientific political theory. The reality is much more complex and interconnected.
That's such a great point. And it really highlights the importance of having a broad and flexible understanding of different approaches when it comes to something as multifaceted as international relations.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one final point that our source material raises. The question of whether political theory can ever be truly scientific.
Ah, yes, the million-dollar question. We've been dancing around this all episode, haven't we? Given all the challenges we've discussed, the role of values, the complexity of human behavior, the limits of empirical observation, it seems like a tough nut to crack.
It definitely is. On the one hand, you have those who argue that political theory should strive for the same level of rigor and objectivity as the natural sciences. They advocate for using quantitative methods, formal models, and even experimental designs to test political hypotheses.
But then you have those who argue that politics, by its very nature, is messy, unpredictable, and deeply intertwined with values, power dynamics, and all sorts of things that are really hard to quantify.
Exactly. They might point to the limitations of predictive models in political forecasting, for example, or the difficulty of replicating experiments in the social sciences.
It seems like a debate that's unlikely to be settled anytime soon.
Probably not, but that's what makes it so intellectually stimulating and so relevant for those preparing for the UPSC. You need to be able to engage with these complex debates and form your own informed opinions.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we? Exploring all the twists and turns that led to the so-called decline of traditional political theory. As we wrap up, let's tackle a question that's been kind of lurking in the background this whole time. A question that's especially relevant, I think, for our UPSC aspirants who are gearing up to tackle international relations. Can political theory ever be truly scientific?
It's a question that has sparked, I think, endless debate, and for good reason. We've seen how movements like positivism and logical positivism, how they champion this idea of a purely empirical approach to politics, emphasizing observable facts, quantifiable data. But can you really measure something as complex as human political behavior with the same precision as you measure, say, the speed of light?
Right. We've been talking this whole time about how factors like values, ideologies, historical context, even emotions, how they play a huge role in shaping political decisions, especially on the global stage. Can you really capture all that nuance in a neat little equation or a statistical model?
It's definitely a tricky balance. On the one hand, we can definitely benefit from using the tools of scientific methodology, rigorous research, data analysis, and statistical models. All of those can help us make sense of patterns and trends in political behavior. But we always have to remember that human beings, and by extension, political systems, they're complex and often unpredictable.
Think about it this way. Imagine you're trying to predict the outcome of a major international summit just by looking at economic indicators or military strength. You'd completely miss out on all the personalities that are involved, the behind-the-scenes negotiations, the historical baggage that each country brings to the table, the role of public opinion in shaping those decisions. There's a whole human dimension to politics that can't just be captured in a spreadsheet.
Exactly. And for you, as you're prepping for the UPSC, this means, developing a critical eye. Don't just accept theories or interpretations at face value. Question them. Ask yourself, what are the underlying assumptions here? What's the evidence? Are there alternative viewpoints that are being ignored?
Think back to all the thinkers that we've discussed in this deep dive. Marx, Comte, Popper, Weber. Each of them offered valuable insights. But they also had limitations. Your strength as a UPSC candidate lies in understanding those nuances, in being able to critically evaluate different approaches and synthesize your own understanding of complex political phenomena.
That's the key. Being able to think for yourself, to analyze information critically, and to construct well-reasoned arguments. And those are skills that'll serve you well not just in the exam, but throughout your career, whether you end up as a diplomat, a policy analyst, or any other profession that requires you to grapple with complex political issues.
So to bring it all back to our initial question, can political theory ever be truly scientific? Well, maybe the real question is, should it be? Maybe the pursuit of perfect objectivity in a field as inherently human as politics. Maybe that's a fool's errand. But that doesn't mean we can't strive for a deeper, more nuanced, and ultimately more insightful understanding of how the world works.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about. We've given you a framework for thinking about these complex issues, a set of tools for analyzing different perspectives, and hopefully a renewed sense of curiosity about the ever-evolving world of political thought.
So as you continue on your UPSC journey, remember, there's no single right answer when it comes to politics. Embrace the messiness, the complexity, the debates, and most importantly, never stop questioning, exploring, and diving deep.
And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the Deep Dive for more insightful explorations tailored for you, our amazing UPSC audience. We'll see you next time.
Until then, keep learning and keep those minds sharp.